You are listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, welcome dear listener. My name is Silas Rose, and this is Awake in Relationship. So I'm starting the new year off with a bang. In general, I've tried to avoid conversations around the pandemic or pandemic response, mostly because it's in the news every day. I think we're all kind of a little bit weary at this point. It's become a really kind of polarizing and emotional topic for many people, especially the longer this pandemic drags on. In the past couple of years, we've all lost something. For some, it might be a loss of a loved one, or perhaps a job or a business. For others, the loss is much more personal and maybe less visible to others. I'm talking about the loss of kind of purpose or community connection, or even hope. Something that's rarely discussed in the public square. In general, the media is really only kind of focused on the economy or a collapsing healthcare system. This episode is unique because it focuses on something more foundational, which is the tension between our individual rights and freedoms and the social contract. It seems almost transgressive at this point to talk about our inalienable rights and freedoms in the COVID era. But my sense is with Omicron, we're kind of entering a new phase of the pandemic response. We're going to have to learn how to live with the virus and any future variants in a way that's not only consistent with science, but also the norms of a free and open society. In Canada, these norms are enshrined in the Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. My guest in this episode of Awake in Relationship is well positioned to speak on the importance of those rights and norms as we enter the third year of the pandemic. The Honourable Brian Peckford was former Premier of Newfoundland Labrador between 1979 and 1989. He's also the sole living architect of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This conversation really is an intimate look into the long history behind the creation of the Charter from the perspective of someone that was actually at the table back in 1982 when the Constitution Act of Canada was signed. So if you're a history nerd like me, I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Well, good morning, Brian Peckford. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I have to say, you're the first premier I've interviewed on the show. Hopefully not the last.
Yes, hopefully not. They're not as approachable today as they used to be.
Yeah, why is that?
Because there's been the concentration of power away from the parliaments of Canada, away from the cabinets of Canada, and concentrated in the First Minister's offices, either the Premier's offices or the Prime Minister's office. And so they're acting more like monarchs and presidents than they are premiers and prime ministers.
Well, we'll go deep into that a little bit later on in this interview.
Okay.
You know, it might be helpful just for the listener to kind of get into your origin story, as it were. You grew up, or rather born, in Newfoundland back before Confederation. I think at that time it was known as a dominion. So not quite a sovereign country, as it were, but a very unique perspective.
It was as much a dominion as Canada was.
Right. How do you think those early life experiences shaped your understanding of freedom and public service and politics?
Well, I was born in 1942, August 1942. So I was 7 years old when we became a province of Canada. In other words, when we relinquished our own sovereignty for that of becoming part of a larger country called Canada. So I was really too small then to really remember very much about it. I just remember that there was a momentous event occurring. But as I grew up under being a province and it being so brand new, you could not help but recognize in the joining that what was happening was that the government became a more dominant feature in the life of people, because suddenly the government of Canada was introducing social programs and stuff that have obviously applied to you as much as they did to other Canadians in any other part of Canada. So perhaps the thing that most stood out as I grew up, and as I went to university, was that whole issue of government becoming more and more influential in the lives and decisions of individuals. And perhaps that would be the greatest thing. The other thing, of course, was, so with all that extra money coming into the province that we didn't have before we were a province, people were very quickly persuaded that this was a wonderful idea because I've got extra money. And sadly, I think that has become sort of the mantra for a lot of the Western world today, not just Newfoundland, but all over the Western world, where over time, government's dominance of the economy and dominance of society generally has increased.
What got you on the road to becoming a politician?
I think it was noticing the unfairness that was happening around me. Mr. Smallwood was the first Premier of Newfoundland. And as he stayed in power, he gained more and more of it, power. And it became really a one-man show. It wasn't a cabinet government. It wasn't a parliamentary democracy. It was a province that was being run like Duplessis was doing in Quebec, as a sort of a one-man show and sort of an autocratic kind of circumstance. And I could see both when I was going to university and when I was in the summertime working as a social worker to get money to go back to university in rural parts of Newfoundland, the unfairness of what was happening, that there was very little fairness applied in the application of programs and things that were happening around the province. Many people, for example, if they disclosed that they were not a Liberal, had great difficulty getting a taxi license, for example. It's just one really personal example of it. And so after I graduated from university and became a teacher, this sort of took on a greater and greater presence in my life as I saw this happening in the riding that I was a teacher, in which I was a teacher. And so I ended up running in that riding as a conservative and got elected as the first conservative ever elected to that riding from 1832 to 1972.
You were pretty young then.
Yes, I was. I was 28 going on 29 when I became a member of the legislature of Newfoundland. And then I quickly became a executive assistant to the Premier and a parliamentary assistant to the Premier in the legislature from 72 to 74. And then I became a minister in 74. And so I was only then like 30, 31 when I became a minister. And then in 1979, at the age of 36, I became the Premier of the province, the youngest Premier ever, and the second youngest First Minister ever. In other words, before Confederation, there were Prime Ministers. And it was the first Prime Minister in 1832 who was younger than me. But after him, there was nobody from 1840 to 1979. So I'm the youngest Premier of the province and the second youngest First Minister ever.
Yeah, it really seems like you came of age in a really kind of critical time in our country as well. And there's really a lot of visionary leadership at that time, between Tommy Douglas and John Diefenbaker Lester B. Pearson, and of course the senior Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Yeah, well, I do agree with most of the names you mentioned as being visionaries. I do have a problem with Trudeau Senior because I was intimately involved with him as it relates to the Constitution Act of 1982 and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was part of that Constitution Act. But you are correct that people like Tommy Douglas and John Diefenbaker in particular, by the way, because it was John Diefenbaker, was the first one in the history of Canada to actually acknowledge individual rights and freedoms as being important. Because when we formed as a country in 1867, through the BNA Act of 1867, there was no provision in that act concerning individual rights and freedoms. Individual rights and freedoms then existed in British common law and conventions and customs as they grew up over time. But there was no written Charter of Rights and Freedoms or Bill of Rights. The United States achieved a Bill of Rights in writing in 1791. We had to wait until 1981 before we had a written Charter of Rights in the Constitution. In 1960, though, John Diefenbaker was the first to acknowledge the idea of individual rights and freedoms and that it was important. And so he introduced into the federal parliament the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights identified rights of expression and rights of religion and freedom of religion and so on. And freedom of the press and the various other freedoms that we later identified in 1981. The big problem with the Bill of Rights, of course, was that it was only a federal act and therefore only applied to federal legislation. And Canada being a federal state, a lot of things happened in the country which had nothing to do with the federal government because the powers were shared between the federal government and the provincial governments. And so while the Bill of Rights was important in the sense of acknowledging the idea of individual rights and freedoms, it didn't cover all Canadians. It only covered some Canadians. That's why the Charter was necessary in 1981, because we all saw that we still didn't have something that covered all Canadians as it relates to individual rights and freedoms. And we also understood that you couldn't have it as a piece of legislation because it would only cover whatever that legislation had jurisdiction over. So a provincial piece of legislation would be no good. A federal piece of legislation would be no good. What was necessary, as we found out from the Americans, is that you needed to put it in the Constitution because the Constitution is national. This is one of the concepts that Canadians have a very hard time understanding, that there's a difference between national and federal. Federal and national don't mean the same thing. Federal only refers to things that come under the federal government. National refers to things that are under all Canadians, regardless of province or federal government. So that's why there was this push for a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1980. There had been many, many talks over the years about doing this. And so it became opportune in 1980. And so we began to negotiate really a number of things, which became the Constitution Act of Canada. It's primarily known for two things, even though there are many, many other things in it. It's primarily known as the patriation, which meant that when we passed this new act, we wouldn't have to refer to England anymore when we changed our constitution. We could do it all in Canada. And so it was not really until 1982 that we became completely sovereign as a nation. So patriation was one thing that was accomplished through the 1981 negotiations leading to the Constitution Act of 1982. And the other thing was to bring in a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that applied to all Canadians, because now it would be in this new Constitution Act. However, it was not an easy ride. it was a very difficult ride. We all met, the 11 first ministers, the premiers, and the prime minister. But halfway through the thing, the prime minister, Pierre Trudeau, decided that we were too difficult to get along with as premiers, and he abruptly left the table and said, "I'll take my marbles and go home." And he did. A lot of us thought he would come back to the table again, that this was a little bit of a fit of pique of his, because he was quite used to having little temper tantrums. And we just thought this was a larger temper tantrum. We were wrong. Some of the premiers had said he wouldn't come back. But what he did was, he not only never came back to the table, he decided that what we were trying to do at the table, he would do alone, unilaterally. That he would pass a bill in the House of Commons, a federal act, not a national act, a federal act, whereby the government of Canada would unilaterally patriate the Constitution and at the same time add on to it his version of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, that caused quite a kerfuffle, and it ended up splitting the premiers. 8 premiers opposed what the prime minister was doing, and 2 premiers supported what he was doing. The 2 that supported him were Ontario and New Brunswick. All the other provinces opposed what he was doing and said it was unconstitutional, and we brought him to court. And 3 court actions were held, one in Newfoundland, one in Quebec, and one in Manitoba, to challenge his constitutionality to do this unilateral act. And on September the 28th, 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled, "Mr. Trudeau, you cannot do this. This is unconstitutional. You need to have many provinces on side in order to do this. All of the conventions and customs of our nation since it was founded, where the provinces are involved and where an act was being brought in which would affect not only the federal government, the provinces, would have to involve the provinces in any change." And so he failed. I am today writing essays and responding to interviews today where people have written that Prime Minister Trudeau rammed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms down the throats of the premiers. It was in the Epic Times newspaper a couple of days ago. And so I'm fighting a rearguard action almost every day where people are totally misinterpreting or don't understand our history. Mr. Trudeau's version of patriation and the Charter was turned down by his own court. As a matter of fact, it was the proposal that I presented on behalf of Newfoundland and on behalf of the provinces that broke the deadlock that led to the Constitution Act and led to the Charter we have today. So really, on that Charter of Rights document, there should be how many signatures? There should be 10 signatures. The only one that shouldn't be on there is Quebec, because they didn't go along with the deal that we signed in 1981. Having just one signature on there misrepresents the history of our country. Trudeau passed nothing. The governments of Canada passed everything. So he lost. So he had to come back to the table and came back for one last negotiation period, November 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 1981, after he had lost 2 months before in the Supreme Court of Canada. And it was on the 5th of November, the last day, that I presented on behalf of the provinces what we had worked on the night before, based upon our original proposal, a proposal which broke the deadlock and made possible later that day the Patriation Act, which became the Constitution Act of 1982.
Is that
Go ahead.
That's the kitchen table accord?
No, we don't. Nobody knows anything about the kitchen table accord. Only a few authors of books that apparently got started from one Senator Mike Duffy, who was a reporter at the time and interviewed Chrétien and McMurtry and Romano, the 3 AGs, one AG for Canada, one an AG for Ontario, and one an AG for Saskatchewan, who gave him this story about them meeting and scribbled down on a couple of pieces of paper ideas that they said then became the Constitution Act of 1982. Nobody else knows anything about this. It's not recorded anywhere. No documents are presented. I was meeting that night, the night of the 4th, in the Saskatchewan suite with my proposal, seeing whether what I was suggesting would break through the deadlock that we had on the 3rd and all day the 4th. And it was that proposal that found favor with most of the provinces that night, which was presented to the group of 8 at breakfast the next morning, and which became the proposal, all, by the way, documented in my book. All of these proposals are available in my book that I produced in 2012, Someday the Sun Will Shine and Have Not Will Be No More. And in the back of that book, in appendices, are these various proposals copied from the documents that I have in my possession. There's no document called the Kitchen Accord. It only exists in the imaginations of certain writers and certain attorneys general who, when I challenge them, go silent.
Canada is really a large country, and it's a diverse country. We have, at that time when you were calling together this agreement, 10 provinces, it sounds like it wasn't a cakewalk, but there was really at least among the premiers, a certain baseline of commitment to debate and consensus building. Is that true?
Yes, especially among the premiers and especially among the group of 8. We were not willing to give up on this. People like Bill Bennett from British Columbia, Peter Lougheed from Alberta, Alan Blakeney from Saskatchewan, Sterling Lyon from Manitoba, for example. Even René Lévesque was interested in individual rights and freedoms. And then you had Premier McLean of Prince Edward Island and Premier Buchanan of Nova Scotia and yours truly of Newfoundland. And there was a fairly strong consensus amongst us that this project that we had now been involved in for 16 or 17 months up until November 1981 was a worthwhile project, and that we weren't prepared to let it go. We wanted it done, but done in a way which was constitutional, which we challenged and won in the court, and then we're able to forge the deal in November. So yes, there's no question that in those days, and thankfully I'm alive to talk about it, unfortunately the only one, that there were people who were involved in nation building and who were not just looking at Alberta or Newfoundland or PEI. They were looking at the nation, Canada. That's very untrue today. We have a very splintered country, and the leadership that's now provided at the provincial level is lamentable. It is sad and unfortunate that we have produced a crop of so-called leaders that no longer stand up for principle and are easily swayed by another 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, well, I don't think Canada is unique that way. I think it's a global phenomenon right now.
Yes, but I thought we were supposed to stand out. I've always, growing up, and even when I was premier, I was always told, repeated over and over again, that we were so much better than the Americans that it wasn't even funny. We had this unbelievable healthcare system, which is falling apart as we speak. And we were just wiser people than the Americans and even the Europeans. Of course, this was all a mythology, and it really didn't exist. But a lot of us went about creating that kind of mythology. And for a number of moments in time, like when Diefenbaker did his Bill of Rights and when the Statute of Westminster was done in 1931 and so on, there were moments when the nation did rise above its pettiness and look more national. But in the last 40 years, one would have to say that we have been moving very much in the wrong direction as it relates to that.
What are the differences, essential differences between our charter and the American Bill of Rights, and what does that say about our national identity?
There's very little difference, really. in how the two have as a matter of fact, the Bill of Rights in the United States seems like it has more power within the jurisprudence of the United States than the Charter of Rights has within the jurisprudence of Canada. And that's really sad, given that the Bill of Rights is a lot older, and you think it would have eroded in its power a lot more than Canada's. Well, that's just the opposite. One of the distinguishing features between the two countries is that they had a Bill of Rights a lot earlier than us, and they have therefore a culture of individual freedom that we did not have. Okay, and that has stood them in good stead. And our 40-year experiment, look what's happening in the United States. There's quite a few courts already ruled against Biden as it relates to his so-called mandates that he thinks he can muscle into existence. And it's quite likely now that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to rule against Biden's mandates. These circuit courts, these federal circuit courts are very powerful, and a lot of them have spoken very eloquently against these mandates applying to right across the United States. So there's very little difference in the concepts of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, and so on. And the individual being important. But in its manifestation on the ground over time, it has meant and seems now to culminate in the next several months, if we're not able to change the way the courts are now starting to rule, if we're not able to change that our democracy will be diminished, if not destroyed, whereas the American system still has a chance to survive. And I say that with a great deal of sadness, because I thought what we did in the 81, constitutionalizing freedoms, making permanent individual freedoms, would not be able to be destroyed the way they have in the last 2 years.
So if I could summarize what you just said, it sounds like there isn't much difference between the Bill of Rights and our charter. But the difference really is just we've only had ours for 40 years. But I also think there's something in the Canadian identity. I think we have a strong adherence to this notion of social contract, and that's certainly represented in our healthcare system, or at least the one that Tommy Douglas conceived. Do you think that makes us more sort of prone to giving up our rights for the supposed benefit of the collective?
Yeah, it seems to me that it does. One's got to be very careful when one makes judgments about a society. For example, the Americans give more than we do to charities. So when you start talking about social contracts, the way they've devised their system is different than ours. I think that's the most one can say. Putting value judgments on various aspects of it is very difficult to do. And remember, our healthcare system began in the 60s, really. And it wasn't with us in 1867. And so it hasn't lasted all that long. And now it's in utter disrepair.
Let's talk more specific about what the charter includes. And I'm also wondering which rights are most kind of impacted right now.
Well, there are four areas of the charter that are most impacted right now, and which I am very vociferous about in my interviews and in my speeches and in my blog. Section 2 of the charter deals with freedoms, and those are freedoms of conscience, freedoms of religion, freedoms of expression, freedoms of the press. These are freedoms identified in those words that I just used in Section 2 of the Charter. Also identified in Section 2 are freedoms of association and freedoms of assembly. They're all in that one Section 2. And as we know today, are mandates from St. John's to Victoria, from Iqaluit to Niagara, which violate our freedom of assembly, our freedom of association, right? Our freedoms even of expression. Because right now, you are not allowed to say certain things that normally would be ordinary speech. and you get censored as a result of it. So that's Section 2, which deals with freedoms. Section 6 deals with rights of individuals. These are all freedoms now, by the way, of individuals. Every single individual in Canada has these freedoms. And then Section 6 deals with mobility. Mobility, the right of a Canadian to travel anywhere in this land or leave this land. That's Section 6. It also says in Section 6, you have the right as an individual Canadian to pursue a livelihood anywhere in this nation. Meanwhile, governments are taking jobs away from people, violating that right to pursue a livelihood in Section 6. Then you have this beautiful Section 7, which talks about rights of individuals, the right of life, the right of liberty, and the right of security of the person. In other words, you're autonomous as an individual. And this business of coercion for you to get a medical procedure is completely anathema and antithesis to security of the person, the right to security of the person, enshrined in our Constitution, enshrined in our Charter of Rights. And then to top it all off, we have that Section 15, which talks about equality before the law. Every Canadian has the right to equality before the law. As we speak, I do not have equality before the law. There are certain places in my little city of Parksville on Vancouver Island where I'm not allowed to go, where other people are allowed to go. And so I'm being discriminated against, and my rights to equality under Section 15 are being violated as we speak. Those are the 4 sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which most talk specifically about our freedoms and rights. Now, even before the first section of the Charter is mentioned, there is something that needs to be said. The Charter begins with the following: whereas we are under the principles of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So the Charter is introduced by 2 special principles: the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And it's only after they are articulated in the Charter that Section 1 begins, which I want to deal with now. But the other point before I go there, I just want to mention not only are those principles there at the beginning, that sentence finishes with a colon, a very important grammatical notation. Why is it a colon? Because what we were saying when we created that, everything that follows comes after. So any judge worth his salt in considering any matter that comes before him that deals with the Charter must first have to accommodate into his rulings that he finally makes the acknowledgement of the supremacy of God and the acknowledgement of the rule of law, that there's permanence here. There's permanence as it relates to God. There's permanence here as it relates to the rule of law. Then I want to quickly go to Section 52 of the Constitution Act, in which the Charter is located, and point out that Section 52 says the Constitution of Canada is a supreme law of Canada as it relates to all these individual rights and freedoms, right? That relates to anything that governments do. It's a supreme law. In other words, when you hear people talking about a Bonnie Henry or this public health officer or that public health officer or this provincial act or that human rights code or this human rights code, they're all subservient to the Charter. They don't come above the Charter. They come below the Charter. You have to meet the Charter in order to bring these in.
So just to interject here for a second, Justin Trudeau keeps citing some non-specific loophole that he and the different premiers are invoking to suspend those rights. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
Yes, I do. One, I think his latest one was a complete diversion, which has to do with the Notwithstanding Act, another part of the Charter, which is not being even used right now, okay, in the pandemic. So it's completely irrelevant, that notwithstanding clause, which could be used in certain circumstances, but by the way, takes an act of the legislature or an act of the Parliament to do, which they haven't done. So they haven't activated notwithstanding clause. So that's complete red herring. What the provinces and the federal government are talking about in trying to manipulate the Charter are using Section 1. Section 1 says, yes, you can override these freedoms below and these rights below under certain circumstances. And those circumstances are, you can overrule it if you can demonstrably justify what you are doing, not just justify, but demonstrably justify. That you do it by law. Most of the stuff that we see being done is done by edict of an order in council or an existing law, not a new law. Number 3, it has to have reasonable limits about it. Most of these things that they've done have no reasonable limits about it. There are new edicts that just come out every month or two. No acknowledgement of reasonable limits. No acknowledgement of a new law. No, by the way, when governments say demonstrably justify, that usually means a cost-benefit analysis of some kind to demonstrate that what you are proposing to do has more benefit than harm. As we know today, most of what the governments have done has more harm than good. Douglas Allen at Simon Fraser University, right in British Columbia here, has demonstrated back in April that the 80 studies that he looked at around the world, there was more harm from the lockdowns and all of the other things that were brought in than good. And so those 4 tests the governments have not met. But here's my argument. As one of the persons that was there when we devised this, that Section 1 doesn't even apply. Because Section 1 was meant to apply when there was a dire situation in the country. Remember, this is put in the Constitution. This is not a federal act. This is not something that's temporary. This is a permanent kind of stuff. We knew what we were doing when we put Section 1 in. And it was meant to apply when there was a war, an insurrection, or other circumstance that affected the existence of the nation. A virus from which 99% of the population recover, and less than 1% pass away, is hardly a circumstance that affects the peril or the nature of the country. And this is one area where I'm going to hopefully be doing a number of affidavits for law firms across the country who are taking action against the governments. And I'm going to say that in an affidavit before the court, that this was not intended for the way the governments have manipulated to date.
Has this been tested?
No, it's only gone to the lower courts. There's a lower court in British Columbia which has completely ignored the supremacy of God concept in the charters, completely ignored the rule of law, and completely ignored any idea as to what the intent of that Section 1 was in the beginning. Besides which, none of them either deal with that even if it did apply, they never passed the 4 tests that were necessary to pass. And so there's a court in Manitoba and there's a court in British Columbia, but it is not the highest court in those provinces. And so where the real action now lies is with a small group of people, the courts of appeal of the provinces and the Supreme Court of Canada. And what I'm going to start to do now in the next days and weeks is identify the names of these people in British Columbia, Alberta, all the way across to Newfoundland, the names of these judges who've yet to hear any appeal from the lower courts about these charter challenges. And I'm going to loudly proclaim their names and say, you have the fate of democracy of Canada in your hands, judges, you few. And then the judges that are on the Supreme Court. In total, let's say there are 6 active courts of appeal judges in the provinces, averaging out. So 10 times 6 will give you 60. And what, there are 9 on the Supreme Court? So we've got 69 people in this country. And all of those, it might not go to every single court of appeal in the provinces. So it's likely to be less than 60 in the provinces that are going to have a say over this. and then the 9 on the Supreme Court of Canada. So we've got less than 100 people in the country right now who are going to decide the fate of our democracy. Now it's up to Canadians. Look, democracy is only as good as the active participation of the civil society. As civil society reduces its active participation, so goes democracy.
I think it's obvious to you and me, but for the listener, especially those that maybe are not listening from Canada, why should we care? Why should we care about the Charter?
Well, why? Well, we should care if we believe in democracy. We shouldn't care if we don't believe in democracy. We can just go on and merrily live our own lives as we think we want to live. But if we're interested in having individual rights and freedoms acknowledged in our Constitution and not being able to be swept aside in this least little emergency that comes along, which was meant for a federal act, not a constitutional act. If we're really interested in individual rights and freedoms and having a parliamentary democracy, then that's why we should care, is because we believe in democracy. But if we don't believe in democracy, then that's fine. Then you can just go on your merry way. I think there are still a majority of Canadians who, once the information is presented to them, like I'm presenting it, who will agree with me that we must save a piece of our Constitution, which only came into existence 40 years ago, and which protects every individual in this country. And that without that, an individual is left to the devices of a capricious majority government from time to time. And that's not the way, surely, we want to live.
Your passion is infectious, and I hope it catches some attention. How can people find out more about your work and your book?
Yeah, you can go to my blog, which is Peckford, Peckford, the number 4, the number 2, the year I was born, Peckford42.wordpress.com. I'm very active on there every single day. And there is a new organization that I'm chairman of, Taking Back Our Freedoms, which has just been formed, and it's got a website now. So just www.takingbackourfreedoms.ca. And that organization is going to spread across the country in every province and try to persuade people along the lines that I'm just talking about today. In other words, that our charter rights are being threatened and violated, and that what we must reestablish those principles as being part of a democracy called Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
This was very much a special interview for me. I think I came away with it with a much deeper appreciation for the Charter and for the country that I grew up in. If you want to learn more about Brian Peckford's work or his books, head over to awakenrelationship.com. I'll post some links in the show notes there. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow me on Instagram or Twitter. I'm always on the hunt for new guests and new topics, so feel free to send me a message either through the website or Instagram with your ideas and feedback. Thank you so much, dear listener, for tuning in. Till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.